Hi everyone, it's Elizabeth here. So I wanted to do this video in regards to kind of the societal and also personal factors that contribute to obesity or the reasons why obesity is so bad in America. So I do want to just kind of express a little bit about my background. I have a master's degree in recreation and tourism, and at that time in graduate school, I met my um, former ex-husband in graduate school, and he studied urban planning. And so when we moved out to the West Coast to Washington State, we actually collaborated on various articles and such, which was talking about kind of physical activity and urban density. So we kind of came from two different areas where it's like I understood the development of the city from a parks and recreation standpoint, but also just through human movement in general and how it's healthy. And then he came from more of the urban planning background to kind of look at the societal structures of things in America. So I do have a lot of blog links below that talk about this. There's an article that I have, which is titled, I gotta look at this now, Fitness in the Built Environment, How Environment Affects Physical Activity. And then I also have other videos and blog links below which talk about obesity and kind of the spiritual perspective of obesity. So when I lived in Walla Walla, Washington, I worked for the YMCA as a kind of a fitness director, and I was able to help with a lot of this group that we had of morbidly obese people. Some of them were in between like 300 and 500 pounds. I wasn't the main leader in that group, but what I came to realize is that a lot of things in obesity do root to a lot of psychological behavior. Everything today roots back to our natural human psychology. The way that you experience and perceive life affects your psychological state. That's why people don't, people getting so hopped up on politics, it's like, you don't understand certain things until it happens to you, and then you become passionate about that certain type of cause. So I have had an overall passion for obesity because I think a lot of it not only is psychological, but there is a lack of spiritual fulfillment as well. Now, there are people who are, fat and happy, and they're like, the most jovial people on earth, and they love being gluttonous, and there's nothing wrong with that. But most people in reality are not happy when they are overweight or obese. So a lot of people do feel their best when they are at a healthy weight where they can move and do activity and things like that. So once you start peeling back the onion layers in the world of obesity, you can kind of start to see that things root back to a lack of self-love, psychological issues, loneliness. There's some sort of traumatic event that triggers this need to go into compulsive or binge eating and things like that. So I do want to talk a little bit about the societal factors that have contributed to obesity in America. People need to understand that today's problems, it's nothing new. These problems root back to the Victorian era, to the time when the Industrial Revolution was starting to come about, and we had all these amazing inventors like Edison and Tesla, the people who were thinking about electricity. And then once electricity came, we had like the electronic sewing machine, and then eventually cars were the big, invention in the early 1900s. People need to realize that America has been socially engineered, and a lot of this has been done through various plans throughout the decades. Now, I have this also different perspective because of living in Germany for a year and a half and exploring 21 European countries. Europeans live in urban, dense populations. The EU also has very strict food regulations, not so much anymore because when I lived there in 2015, Bayer, the pharmaceutical company in Germany, and what is that called? Oh, Monsanto, they merged. That was just after Obama signed the Monsanto Protection Act here in America. So where am I going with this? In Europe, they live in dense populations. So they move daily for modes of transportation. So they walk to work, they bike to work, they walk to the train station to take the train to work. Movement is a part of their daily life. they walk to the grocery store. You know, you live in little old cobblestone neighborhoods where you can't park a big ass SUV, so they are just physically built on living in a built environment that is dense. And when you are in Europe, you have a city, and then you have nature and farmland, and then you have a village, then you have nature and farmland, and then the next village, farmland and nature. So the thing is, in America, with the creation of the suburbs and the Highway Transportation Act in 1956, basically we came to move away from more dense urban populations to suburban sprawl. So the highway actually benefited the car industry. And, you know, you kind of built up this American dream of living in the suburbs and having that beautiful home with the white picket fence and everything like that. So nearly 50 years ago, walking was a frequent mode of transportation because of the city population that lived within walking distance of work, shop, recreation activities, as well as parks and entertainment means. So I'm from Cleveland originally, born and raised. So if you look at the history of Cleveland, Cleveland was a hot and happening place in the 50s. And then, you know, the Highway Transportation Act, the suburban sprawl really killed off Cleveland, and Cleveland ended up becoming a desolate place, especially later on, you know, 40 years later, 30 to 40 years later in the 80s and 90s. So the Federal Highway Act of 1956 and other policies increased the construction of roads and highways, which encouraged Americans to reside in the suburbs. The urbanization of America in the last century demanded the use of the automobile. Therefore, walking became outdated. The suburban sprawl is commonly known as the unchecked distribution of a city's population outward toward lower density areas. That means you are car dependent. New developments utilize segregated land use that separates residential from retail. As a result, Americans became highly automobile dependent. And so, excuse me, the interesting part about that is if people want to actually walk somewhere, they want it to be a very pleasing or appeasing place, but also something that stimulates the senses. So when you look at places and cities, especially like Detroit, you have a lot of food deserts. So there are residential suburban neighborhoods that are disconnected from massive like retail and grocery store places. And so the only thing that is nearby are like the gas stations or the convenient marts or the drug marts, the 7-Eleven. And obviously, if you know what is sold in those type of environments, it's not healthy, nutritious food. It's a lot of processed food that has also contributed to obesity. Now, and in those food deserts, it's like a lot of times they're walking, you know, on the side of the road that has no sidewalk. It's like not really a safe place. It's not a designated place for walkers. So generally in America, especially today, you have the lower population, or sorry, the lower educated and the lower socioeconomic populations are generally more obese because they are living off of more processed food, or they're getting a lot of food free from the food pantries, which are things like canned green beans, which has like high sodium and stuff like that in there. Now, you have to understand the history of processed foods. Everything starts to root back toward that Victorian era, early 1900s. So trans fats were actually invented in the 1890s, and then some of that started to enter into the food supplies in the 1910. So in 1910, we had certain things like Oreo cookies, Crisco and Jemima syrup, Nathan's hot dogs, Hellman's mayonnaise, marshmallow fluff. Those are certain type of foods that came out over 100 years ago at this point. In the 1920s, women were primarily, you know, preparing food from scratch, still like their ancestors, but certain ready-to-make foods started to become available, and that started to save the housewives a little bit more time because certain things like gas stoves and electric refrigerators and things like that were actually new inventions, and they were becoming a part of the American home. Some processed foods from the 20s, like Kool-Aid, Peter Pan peanut butter, Reese's peanut butter cups, Van Camp's pork and beans, Wheaties, popsicles, Velveeta cheese came out. Then in the 30s, you had the Great Depression where people had to live very, very thrifty. And so, you know, certain whole foods were not necessarily always available, but they did rely on certain processed foods during that time. But probably during the Depression era, they ate a lot of basic stuff like bread, potatoes, and meat, whatever they could get their hands on. But processed foods that came out in the 30s, Snickers, Three Musketeers, Spam, Kraft macaroni and cheese, some Ritz crackers. The 40s, you had a lot of rationing because of World War II to feed the soldiers. So a lot of convenience foods were actually created, which was like instant coffee and cake mix, as well as like dehydrated juice. The first Dairy Queen and the McDonald's restaurants actually opened in the 1940s. And so farmers started to use fertilization and irrigation to increase the crop yields, which unfortunately does decrease the vitamin and the mineral content in those plants. And then you started to have government subsidies. They started to use corn and soy, which led to the creation of high fructose corn syrup, hydrogenated oils, modified corn starches. A lot of those things became readily available or used in a lot of processed foods. Pillsbury is a popular 1940s brand that came out, and something like Cheetos. Now, the interesting thing is what you see today with obesity, especially if your parents or grandparents are baby boomers, you kind of see that a lot of kids were grown up in the 50s on TV dinners. So my family immigrated from World War II. They survived World War II and then immigrated to the United States in 1951. And I remember my great-grandmother talking about how they were handed like the government block of cheese. It was like Kraft cheese, and that's how, she used that cheese to put in her pierogies, which is a lot different than the pierogies that they would make in the old world in the Ukraine and Poland. So fast food restaurants in the 50s started to come out everywhere, and there were certain like FDA food additives that also kind of came out. It kind of became, that's when the TV started to come out and become popular as well. So TV dinners were readily available. If people lived on government, it lived off the government for food support, in the 50s and the 60s, that's where you saw a lot of people living off of Spam and hot dogs and things like that. So if you continue through, a lot of processed foods in the 60s ended up becoming like Gatorade, Pringles, anything in a aluminum can. So I think pop came out in the 60s. The 70s, you started to have a little bit more of the meal replacements. So you had things like Hamburger Helper, McDonald's Happy Meals came out. And the interesting thing, if you watch that movie, the McDonald's movie with Michael Keaton in it, Michael Keaton definitely was a tyrant and a monster, wanting to make this great family diner into a massive U.S. corporation, which he ended up succeeding at. But in the movie, if you look at the one point where he has a meal, he sits down at a restaurant with somebody, and they're like, hey, we can help you cut some profit, that they replaced to reduce the milk that actually went into the milkshake, they used this powder formula. And so the woman pours the powder formula into a glass of water and mixes it up, and it gave like that great vanilla flavor. So the interesting thing is the greed and our America's soul has been sold, and it's always been sold for profit. And the way to make a profit is to decrease your costs and also increase, the use of things that are cheap, which is a lot of filler and artificial ingredients to make, the cans of soup last, 4 years instead of 1 year. The 1980s are definitely a sad decade for kind of real food, because this is when artificial sweetener and aspartame was approved by the FDA. So my mother told me the first time she had a Diet Sprite in the 80s, she actually broke out in hives. And think about that. That's really quite amazing. And then, we could kind of think about like the 90s through today. Everything today is basically processed. Pasta is technically processed because it's coming, it is a piece of whole wheat that is grounded down into a flour to create, mixed with water to create a pasta. So these are some societal issues. This problem has been, whether some people want to argue that it's an actual plan, it is a combination of greed and societal structures. You increase the shittiness of the food, let's put it that way. You decrease the nutrient count, and you increase the sedentary lifestyle by making, this life so car dependent. And I feel like urban planners in America have completely wrecked and ruined. It's like we had all this open space, so it's like let's just build everywhere. You drive through the middle part of the country, and driving from Toledo, Ohio to Cleveland, Ohio, it's like all you see are just like industries and industries all packed up along the freeway, just box stores, whether that's like an adult mart, for a porno video, to just like an electrical company has their boxed office space like right there on the freeway. So this is definitely a plan, and now I think throughout this new millennial, especially in the last 10 or so years, people are fighting back and they're wanting things to be more sustainable. They want things to be less GMO. They want things to be healthier. They want to be able to move. So that's one of the great parts about America, with millennials, at least in that sense, that are kind of like fighting back, like, hey, like, I'm sick of Monsanto being able to take over the farms. I want to have local, sustainable food. And this is why people are buying their own land, or not necessarily a farm, but a house with the land so they can grow their own food and have their own chickens with eggs and things like that. So a lot of our history and how we lived pre-Victorian era is starting to come back and re-revolutionize itself, like kind of like we're like pioneering again. So those are some societal issues. Now, on the more social and personal problems, there are people today who are just grown up in unhealthy households. So, for example, if your parents grew up on TV dinners in the 50s and the 60s and they never changed their ways, most likely you have been born into a household that has negative eating habits. So if your father was addicted to Coca-Cola, most likely you grew up drinking Coca-Cola like it was water, or it was just a part of your everyday lifestyle. For me and my family was really big in gardening, and we weren't allowed to buy like boxed sugary cereals. Like once a month we were, and then something like soda pop was only drunk when we went out to dinner as a family on like a Saturday night type of thing. So one, you could have just been raised in a negative eating household, let's put it that way. Like you were not taught how to cook food. You were taught how to put, to peel off the film on a frozen dinner and put that in the microwave. So overall, with the increase of technology, we have decreased our abilities to live like a normal human being, and being able to sustain life through nutritious and healthy eating. A lot of millennials today don't know how to cook. I had this conversation with a Scottish guy when I lived in Hanover. He was there for an agricultural conference, and I was working at a hotel kind of bar and cafe. And he was saying that young Scottish millennials today, they don't know how to cook. And one of their big things at this agricultural conference was actually to adopt and accept the imperfect produce more, because they said usually at the bottom of the barrel, what's left over is the imperfect, ugly produce. Like, the standard mom wants that perfect red pepper, or they want that potato that looks like a potato and it's not like all squiggly and stuff like that. So, the rise of imperfect produce has definitely been a big thing to reduce food waste, which is a good thing. So you might have been taught bad habits. Now, with some people, there's definitely a trigger. They go through some sort of traumatizing life event, whether there is a death, they might have been like raped or abused. A lot of sex addicts or people who are victims of some sort of sexual abuse end up becoming obese. and eating a lot because they don't want to seem attractive to the opposite sex. So something in their psychology, in their subconscious mind, is actually making them want to be unattractive to men. And so a lot of them tend to reach out to food for non-nutritious reasons, to make them not seem attractive. Usually some people go through a traumatic event as well, whether a loved one died or they just went through like a series of hardships and they kind of hit rock bottom, and they coped with their emotions through food, basically. And that tends to spiral out of control more if you are also from a household that did not teach you healthy eating habits. So, if you're used to coping your emotions with ice cream, or you just grew up on like binge eating ice cream, if something traumatic happens to you, most likely you yourself will reach out to that substance to help cope with whatever traumatic event you're dealing with. The traumatizing event definitely happens. There's usually a trigger. Some people just, other people, they just lose their standard. I think society today has lost their standards. We have become too complacent on too many things. Dressing up and going out, like what you see in Europe, like people actually dress up when they go out. Not necessarily like to the nines, but they actually look presentable. We don't really do that anymore. We just kind of wear sweats and stuff like that. So we kind of just lost our standards, and also raised in cultures or communities that don't really have good perspectives. I remember this in college when I gained a bunch of weight. It was like, oh, well, grandma and great grandma were fat and obese. So we just like bought clothes to kind of grow into. So it's like, oh, I was a size medium, but I started buying size large because it was just acceptable to become fat and overeat. So another thing today with modern society is that I do think we are repeating the Roman Empire's history here. So the Romans are super gluttonous, but in a very, they were also very decadent with like eating and sex and wine and stuff like that. But obviously the food that they were eating was it was all whole food, natural food, as compared to today. So I think today we live in this party decadent lifestyle where you see a bunch of stuff on TV, like the social engineering that comes through the movies, like Sex and the City. You see these 4 beautiful women sitting around, and they're always eating and they're always drinking, and they're super thin and fit, and they look like bombshells, and somehow that gets seeped into a lot of people's subconscious mind to want to live that lifestyle. But the reality is you can't live that type of lifestyle of eating out all the time, especially if it's not fine dining, and expect to, maintain a healthy weight. A lot of people, alcohol is part of their diet for sure, and they don't want to give up alcohol. And it's 3,500 calories to a pound. And, if you think about just consuming a 6-pack of beer a week, think about that. Think if you just come home and crack a beer every night of the week. That's what, like 100, 150 calories. So in a month, you're drinking almost a pound just in liquid that has absolutely no nutritional value for you besides giving you a buzz. And then, once one beer doesn't give you a buzz, you need 2, and then eventually you need 3, and then eventually you're drinking an entire bottle of wine. So, these things like liquid calories and stuff add up, and that doesn't even include the food that you need to eat in order to sustain life. So, yeah, I think today we are taught a lot of bad skills, especially because you see some really, fit and in shape people in movies and on TV, and people want to look like that, but they also want to live the decadent lifestyle of what they're seeing on TV, and the two don't go hand in hand with each other. Unless you only drink and you never eat, which, you'll start messing up your brain chemicals and stuff if you do that. It's not sustainable. That's not how life is. especially in this sedentary society where we drive to work and we sit at a desk. There's no way that you can be fit and in shape as like a Hollywood person and all the shit that you see in Sex and the City and stuff like that. It doesn't work like that. It's a fantasy. It's an illusion. Now, the French, they eat a lot of fatty foods that come from the actual animal, the cheese and the meats, and they drink a ton of wine, but they're also eating their lunch over like a 1 to 2 hour time period. So they're eating at a very slow, methodical pace that's very enjoyable. It's not just like rushing and shoving down a sandwich in your face 10 minutes before your lunch meeting. And they also move a lot more. Walking and biking is a mode of transportation for them. So Europeans, they do, especially in the wintertime, they have to sustain some sort of like hibernation fat on them. So a lot of their food is high fat and, like high carbohydrate, but they're also moving a lot more. And it's just a different mentality there. So these are some thoughts that I have on some societal as well as personal kind of factors that are the reasons for obesity or at least contribute to obesity. If you have any thoughts, feel free to share. I've posted down below various articles on this topic for obesity, some things that you can do to kind of help get you back on the right track and some of the lack of spiritual components in one's life. That kind of contribute to obesity as well. So it kind of comes from a different angle. And yeah, so anyways, these are some thoughts that I have. Thanks for liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like my voice and my message, please subscribe below. See you guys next time. Bye.